Okay, we're ready to. All right, good afternoon. This is Lehigh County Authority Board of Directors meeting of May 22nd, 2023. Meeting is being recorded for our meeting records. Let's go right into a roll call for the Board of Directors. President.
Okay, roll call of the board. Brian Noggle.
Here.
Amir Famili.
Here.
Ted Lyons.
Here.
Linda Rosenfeld.
Here.
Norma Cusick. We're gonna come back to her because she's trying to enter the room. Kevin Baker. Jeff Morgan.
Here.
Sean Ziller. Mark Ramis.
Here.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see you. Okay, Norma Cusick. Norma, are you here? And Sean Ziller.
Here.
We did not. Norma, if you're on, can you unmute and acknowledge?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Thanks, Norma.
Okay, now we begin the meeting. All right, thank you. We do it for us. Thank you. We'll start off with a review of the agenda and move for an executive session.
All right, I do not have any suggested changes to the agenda, but there will be an executive session following the close of the regular meeting regarding personnel matter.
Okay, thank you. All right, the information packages were sent out via email and as well as hard copy and is available online for this meeting. If anybody did not receive that information, let me know. Okay, so we now move on to the approval of the minutes of May 8th, 2023 board meeting.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes of May 8th.
No, I will second. Sean will second.
All right, Linda made the motion and Sean seconded that motion. Any questions on the minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
All right, ayes have it, thank you. Moving on to public comments. This is the opportunity for anybody in the public to talk about any issues that are not on the agenda. Anybody would wish to make any comments?
No, thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. All right, moving on. We have one item under action and discussion. It is under the water category of Central Lehigh and Northern Whitehall System Water Supply Study. It is a presentation that we discussed.
Yes, so for this one, Phil DePoe will do the introduction. I just want to say we've been working on this study for quite some time now and have some preliminary results to talk with you about. And looking forward to hearing the presentation today. I don't believe we're asking for any direction necessarily or any action today, just a presentation of where we are with that study. Phil?
Yes, thanks, Lisa. Thank the board. We have Mike Brown with us, we have Aaron Locks with us, we get it Fleming. Mike, you've been with LC, you're doing LC for a number of years now, haven't you?
Yeah, 10 plus,
10 plus.
15 years.
And Aaron's, you've been the Gannett for quite a while too, helping out. So what we're going to talk about today is finally another topic besides sewer. We're going to talk about water, and specifically the Central Lehigh Division. And as a refresher, the board authorized Gannett Fleming to do the water supply study back last February already. And right after that was authorized, we had that Reservoir 1 issue where we had to resolve that very fast. So there's been a little bit of delay with that. And then Gannett was hired by Emmaus for their PFAS situation. So there's been a little delay because of that as well. But now both of those are behind us. So that's why we're talking today. I do want to just, before the presentation, I do want to reiterate, this is not a one and done study. This is gonna be a multiple phases. This is just the first phase. The water supply study. And, Aaron will talk about some more next steps. Before you turn over to Mike. Gannett created the water model for the Central Lehigh Division back in 2011. And the city division in 2017. So now both systems are modeled with a software called Water Gems. And Aaron will get into more details about that. But specifically about LCA in the Central Lehigh Division, we actually started this process way back in 2020 for a potential new large user up by the Boston Beer area. So this has been, again, this is an ongoing process, not a one and done. With that being said, turn over to Mike.
Share your presentation. Okay. Presentation is going to be shared on screen and is posted to our website, so.
Well, first, thanks for having us. It's nice to actually get out and talk about what we do once in a while. Last time we're sitting at the desk producing designs and studies, so it's great to actually get out with an interested audience. So, yeah, I mean, as Phil kind of introduced, over the course of the past 10 years, I've been doing a lot of work here, distribution system. And one of the themes that's kind of reoccurred as we've done some various studies and offshoots and designs is a potential need for additional water supply in the Central Lehigh system. Particularly kind of came to light a few years ago when we did a study, again, with a very large user in the industrial area. And that really is kind of, always a variable, with your system in that particular area. You occasionally get some really large use requests. And as we'll kind of describe today, as you see, your system right now is in good shape, but kind of on anything like that could tilt it to the point that, yeah, you're in more of an immediate need. So this type of study is intended to try to get out in front of some of that, proactively plan for the future, address some needs right now. So as we talk through this and describe where we're at, I think the theme is, look at some existing needs. Also, this study allows us to look at the future. So anything we're addressing now is also going to be a component of a long-term solution as well. So yes, as we kind of described, I've been with Gannett Plumbing for about 25 plus years now. I always pause every time I say it. It makes me feel older and older every time I say it. But and I've been, like Bill mentioned, I was involved in building the water system model in 2011. I've done a lot of, distribution, hydraulic work with LCA since then, master planning, asset management, heavily involved with your water main replacement program. Erin has been involved probably for at least 5 years of that. She's one that basically runs the model at this point and knows the model inside and out. Really kind of led the charge on this study and really is going to kind of talk us through what we're looking at. And again, in terms of where we're at today, we've gone through established actually maybe the next slide. I think that's the next slide. So this is kind of the agenda of what we're talking through today. Again, we'll kind of establish the need of why we did this study to begin with. One of the key components of a study like this is forecasting the future of water demands. Right, so you got to figure out, again, anytime you're talking about a capital need such as water supply, you want to make sure you're looking out at least probably about 20 years, maybe beyond that. So we projected demands out to 2045. Again, the industrial corridor is always a big variable there as far as what those demands might be. We then compared the demands relative to your existing supplies to figure out, again, where you stand. One of the things that we're going to focus on a bit here is risk and vulnerability. So when you're talking about water supply, we'll get into this a little bit more, but there's really two components of it. One is you have enough supply just to meet your demands on a normal good day, no emergencies in the system. But then you also want to be able to have some backups in case you do have a problem, a well is down, you have a major main break, things like that. So we'll talk through some of those vulnerabilities in terms of what they are. And ultimately, alternatives to address, those vulnerabilities. Again, we'll talk about this in terms of what that supply need looks like. And we'll also talk a little bit about North Whitehall. So, with this study, again, primary focus was Central Lehigh Division, but we also knew that there's a supply need in North Whitehall, so we did incorporate that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And again, ultimately, where we're at today is presentation of findings, short of conclusions just yet. Again, we'll talk about next steps, but basically we've gone through, established a bunch of alternatives, established needs. Our next steps are going to be working with your staff again to kind of prioritize what those needs look like, establish some forecasts on capital costs, things like that, and then come back, hopefully with the other ones here with some recommendations.
And before Aaron begins, I do want to just reiterate that, it's good timing with the 537 for the sewer side. So we have municipalities projections. So it was not done in a vacuum. That's my point. There's overlap between the two.
Yeah, we leaned heavily on work that was already done, even our past studies, 537 plan that allowed us to kind of, again, not reinvent the wheel and pick up where a lot of these other studies left off. And one of the other things too is, we talked about this early on, we've done various studies, other engineering firms have done various studies. One of the purposes of this approach is bring all this stuff together, consolidate, look at everything. So you're holistically looking at all these past studies in terms of needs, so making sure we're including everything and have essentially, again, a centralized plan to move forward. So that I'll turn over to Aaron, who's getting the brains of this.
Okay, so we wanted to start out just with an overview of water supply in the Lehigh Valley. I've called out a few major water suppliers in the area. I've also noted, some of their major water sources. So you have the Little Lehigh Creek for Allentown, the Lehigh River, which Allentown uses as a secondary source, but NBMA, Northampton also uses, and the Delaware River for Easton. So we have Allentown provides water to the Central Lehigh Division and South Whitehall Township, which is on there. It also provides water to a few other smaller municipalities in the area. We've got Salisbury and I believe Whitehall Township as well. And we are currently working with Phil on establishing or investigating emergency interconnections with Bethlehem, between the Allentown system and Bethlehem. And I know Bethlehem is also pursuing emergency interconnections with Easton Suburban Water Authority to the east and Northampton to the north. So really just wanted to kind of show you or just give a good picture of how connected the major water suppliers are in the system to each other. You have North Whitehall is connected to NBMA up north as well.
And then just for the board's sake, you also have the model for Northampton and you have the model for Easton as well.
Yep,
correct?
correct. Yep.
And as we progress with the study, as you see, it does become somewhat of a regional type of, not necessarily solution, but that the regional approach plays into any of the alternatives.
So we're gonna start with Central Lehigh just because, that was our biggest challenge moving forward. So like I did with the Lehigh Valley, we'll go into a brief overview of your Central Lehigh Division system. Sure, many of you already know that it is the largest water system owned and operated by LCA. I think it serves approximately, the water system serves approximately 18,500 customers, whereabouts in Upper Macungie and Lower Macungie townships. This system is made up of 3 pressure zones, which are displayed in the 3 different colors you see on screen right now. You have the lower system in blue, which is the 584-foot pressure zone. The pressure zones are all named after the hydraulic grade they operate at And then the green and pink piping to the north make up your upper system, 2 pressure zones up there. So you have in green your 688 foot pressure zone, and then in pink, the 846 foot pressure zone, which we also call the Applewood system.
Question, what is a pressure zone? I was thinking- Yeah, so basically it's the service level that's established to maintain adequate pressures to all the customers. In other words, when the customer opens up top, there needs to be a range of pressure there to get adequate service. So with varying elevations, you establish different pressure levels, different pressure zones, so that you have some uniformity across a certain area in terms of maintaining that service pressure.
And they're established via like pumps or control valves to maintain.
Yeah, so the higher areas, you're gonna pump the water up to, lower areas, you've got valves that break pressure.
Bring it down. Yep. So, water, source water for this system, go back. We still want to show sorry. It's goes through, the map.
This one.
No, the map we were just at. Yes, the black line on screen. That is your Allentown interconnection. So that is about, 3 miles of a single 24-inch diameter pipe that provides water to the CLD system from the city of Allentown. This flow is supplemented by various wells throughout the system. So there are about 11 wells, I believe, scattered throughout the blue area, that lower system. And there are 2 wells that supplement the upper system. Your system also has, I believe, 4 storage tanks. So the upper system has about 2 million gallons of storage at Reservoir 1, and then there are 3 storage tanks in the lower system, totaling about 8 million gallons. Wells, like I said, there are 11 active wells in the lower system, 2 active wells in the upper system. Along with those active wells, you have 5 that are reserve status, and we'll get into that in the next slide. So these are your sources. You have the Allentown interconnection at the bottom. It's about 7 million gallons a day that you get through that interconnection, that single pipe. You also have a number of wells. Like I mentioned, there are 5 that you see up there that are reserve status, and 2 abandoned. The reserve status wells, I believe you have to go through a re-permitting with DEP in order to get those returned to active status. So we go ahead.
Were put on reserve for various reasons, treatment needs and things like that over the years. As you see, a lot of the reserve ones are smaller producing wells, so it's kind of a financial decision. Operations decision that to get these wells active at a lower capacity, just by the operational capital costs.
So just that comment, so without the Allentown interconnect, if something would happen there, we'd be in.
You're about it. You came to the conclusion. So yeah, that will be a big theme as we go.
Okay.
Yep, so we looked at your CLD's source capacity 3 different ways. So we looked at the first column is current operating capacity, and that was provided to us by LCA operations staff, believe when we started this process back in February 2022. So that's what these wells typically run at each day, like on average for the year. We then looked at source capacity based on what the permitted capacities are for each well. So we included capacities for those reserve status wells that aren't operated, like Mike just said. And these are the capacities based on, I think I looked at the Delaware River Basin Commission capacity. So when these wells were originally permitted, what they were permitted to be able to draw.
And that's often the case where you have a difference, particularly with well sources, where a difference between theoretically what the maximum you can take out, what you were permitted to take out, and then what the well currently produces, which you again often at the time, the wells may degrade a little bit in terms of the casing in the well pump, things like that. So that's kind of the difference between those three numbers up there.
Yep, and then finally, like Mike said, theoretical capacity, so that's what we believe that could be drawn based on like hydrogeological conclusions, and I believe we used Arrow's 2006 immediate term water supply study to get some of those theoretical capacities. So that would be for like well one, where you see the permitted capacity is 500 based on drawdown tests Arrow did 20-ish years ago. They believe that more water is available to be drawn from that well. I believe so our totals at the bottom are in gallons per minute. Sometimes for me, it's easier to think about things in million gallons per day. So those totals are current operating capacity is about 17.7 million gallons per day. Permitted capacity is 25.8 million gallons per day, and theoretical is 1 million gallons more, 26.8 million gallons per day. Here we did want to briefly mention that I know Mike mentioned Emmaus and there's past issues with their wells. We did look into that, and with the new regulations, there are 3 of your lower producing wells are just slightly over those new regulations. And I know there are ways to kind of get around
It's
that.
not necessarily conclusive data yet, it's still preliminary, but there's 3 wells that that we're seeing that are either right at the limit or potentially slightly over the limit. Again, it still needs some investigation to kind of confirm that what the needs might be, but
I believe it's like well 10, which you see is only 100 gallons per minute. So they're the lower producing wells, and we conservatively remove them from the calculation moving forward.
as far as when we're establishing future need versus your existing supplies, just to be conservative, we pull those out just in case they do in fact the treatment, just to kind of see where we're at.
You mean the DEP limits or the EEP?
We look at the EPA, the upcoming EPA ones.
A question. The limit, how is that limit established? Who does it?
The PFAS limit? A bunch of scientists and politicians need to know. Is that the easiest way to say it? It's so the latest limit, again, we could have a whole separate meeting on PFAS, but the latest limit was established at the federal level, EPA. They do a whole bunch of health-based science in terms of risk and things like that, and that's kind of where they come up with it. That's the easiest answer I can give without getting into the detail on it.
Thank you.
So after, this was task 1 where we established existing capacity in Central Lehigh Division. And then the second task was, as Mike mentioned, projecting your future demands. So
Eric, before you go on, the past slide there, well number 24 had greater current operating capacity than permanent amount. What's with that?
So that could be.
I believe it's that's the calculating type error. So these wells, well 24,
Okay.
we calculate that based on, it's running 24 hours a day. I believe that.
That doesn't cause us any issues with.
No.
23 and 24
Yes,
are all kind of
they combine, right?
Fine, yeah.
Yeah, so, it's a good valid question. For the sake of this study, it does, because it's only 20 gallons per minute, so it's rather trivial. From an operations perspective, we would want to, I suspect if we dug into that in terms of the division between the same spot, 24 would actually be producing below the permanent capacity. In terms of, the numbers that we use for us, that's why it jumps out.
Yeah.
That's a good catch.
Okay, so demands. So we projected, Mike said, up to 2045. We used, like Phil said, all the available data we had. So we used data collected from the approved interim Act 537 plan. We used data he was collecting through the ongoing Act 537 plan, so Act 2050. So these are developers that have requested connections to the CLD system, or I guess the wastewater system within the CLD operating area. We also used similar information that we collected previously in our Gannett Fleming's 2020 upper system study, which also looked at demand projections for the upper system. We took into account, requests for increased usage from large users, such as like Boston Beer, is it Dr. Pepper, things like that. So that's where we have the two different demand projections, what we call known growth, which will be the stuff from Act 537. So we know the developer has requested a connection to the system, and that should go through. And then we have what we call all potential growth. So that includes those requests from those large users, potential growth into like Low Hill Township, Weisenberg Township. That wasn't a huge factor, but we wanted to look at that as well. And that's why we have those two different numbers up there, just to look at as conservatively as we possibly could with demand projections. I think it's important to note that it is really large user driven. You can see that difference of how much higher that is.
And as we alluded to again, these are kind of living, right? I mean, as Phil mentioned, a study like this, once you get it active, you can actually continuously revisit it. If you have a large, the large user we looked at a couple of years ago, I think that was upwards of 2+ MGD.
Yeah, and that was the average.
Yeah, so if you get a large user like that, that's not accounted for something like this. Again, we provide some level of conservative on this, and we the solutions, we're thinking of that, but any day you could have an extremely large user come into that industrial corridor that could skew those demands even further up than we have on.
And we look at it on an average day demand basis. That's the blue lines. So that's where we look at, usage or production over a whole year and average it over those 365 days. And then we look at the red lines are your maximum day demand basis. So that's, a single point in the year that was your maximum day production.
Could you walk us through this graph?
Yeah.
So if you take 2025, right?
Yep.
So the blue line tells you what we know for facts that the consumption would be.
The straight lines to the left are what we know for facts. Oh, and then the blue line that Lisa is pointing to right now is what we know productive consumption will be based on developer requests to connect.
Today we know for fact that
Yes.
it's under contract, whatever it is.
Projection.
It's project, yes.
Yeah, they still could back out, but that's basically requests that have come in and said, hey, developer X wants to put whatever here, and that's the usage.
A new residential community, a new warehouse, and then the line on top of that, where you kind of see that peak around 2035, that includes demand. So it includes those demands we just discussed, but it also includes demands that from large users. So there have been requests from Boston Beer to increase the amount of water they get from CLD.
Probably inquiry is probably the better term there, not necessarily
Request.
Yeah.
That's true. They've kind of come to, Phil or Amy and said, we're thinking, how much water can we get?
And
One is projection, the other one is guess.
They're both projection, but yes, one is more
certainly one's more,
conservative.
yes,
Yeah.
and the other, the higher dash line too, that also includes, again, just some guess, educated guess on open area, future development that isn't planned yet, and things like that.
So the bottom line is like 40% probability, that the top line 10%.
I would go.
I'm just throwing a number, so I'm just trying to.
I would go the bottom line, well, you're speaking the same language as the municipalities are about how are we supposed to make these projections for sewer. So it's the planning, it's Upper Macungie and Lower Macungie's planning department's best guess through the year 2045 is what it is.
The projections look very conservative compared to the reality of 2019 through 2022. It's just, can you identify which consumers were those big users at 5-year period?
Certainly Dr. Pepper came
Dr.
in.
Pepper.
That's almost 500,000 right there. And then there's been, you know, all the upper McKenzie developments. Lisa, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think the other thing you have to, or I'm not sure about 2019 to 2020, but we also had the pandemic impacts, which really kind of for a year and a half, our water consumption was sort of all over the place with residential and commercial, but Dr. Pepper was the big one. And then a pretty significant amount of apartments, even single family type development going on in 2021.
But it just takes one big user to blow this whole thing apart.
Yeah, and that's, like I said, as you'll see as we go through this, that's something we're keeping in mind in terms of, you know, any alternatives that are selected, you know, allowing some buffer there to incorporate some of that unknown with one of those potential large users.
And to circle back to the sewer discussion, if you remember, Jim Sheldon from Arcadis reiterating the fact that 80% of the projections for sewer through 2050 are front-loaded in the next 10 years. So all the entire region has front-loaded, I mean, all the projections through the next 10 years. That was just done by happenstance. They all did it. They all think the next 10 years is going to be the busy time, and then it tapers off.
Yeah, I mean, this is all is cost, right? So depending upon how you load those things. So the discussion we have, the reason we're asking this question, you know, are you going to front load 20 years, 5 years, 10 years? And where is the sweet spot that has a less cost impact to LCS? So that's the reason, you know, we're trying to better understand this probability that we are talking about here.
I think the other piece we have to always be thinking about is how that affects, like, the projects will affect tapping fees or the ability for new users to connect. So we either do a project and it sits unused and that's a abandoned asset potentially, or, you know, risk, versus not having it when you need it. But I mean, in some cases, we're negotiating, just earlier this year, we're negotiating with a potential new user about having them pay for the pump station that's needed to bring the water to their facility, and trying to time those things with when the development is actually happening. Versus what I think the study is trying to do is look at kind of the resiliency of the system as a whole to serve the region for what we know is likely to happen, and not as much concerned about the speculative nature of the industrial piece.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, with, you know, that study we did a couple of years ago for that one specific large user, if that did go through, again, in all likelihood, they would pay for a significant component of the capital improvements that would be required solely because of them. I think, as you'll see, again, we have a list of alternatives, and, you know, what I think we'll talk about again in a little bit is what is kind of the current need versus the future need. And again, I think any key to planning is addressing the current need while keeping an eye on the future. So you don't want to do something that is going to be, you know, miss those unknowns before. So anything that you do short term, 5 years, 10 years, make sure it's kind of building towards what a future solution would be anyway. So I think that's, you know, again, it's difficult to answer that percent probability just because it's all speculative. All the growth numbers are speculative. So I think when you come up with solutions, you just have to keep that in mind, that you know that there's unknown to the projection, so that any solution you come up with, again, is going to meet the current need while still working towards a future need, if that future need might be larger than what we're projecting right here.
How about a lead time to meet an unknown future lead? Is that factored in somehow that something happens to really?
Yeah, I'm gonna turn to Chuck. If, as a result of the 2020 study, there's a pump station that was identified.
Yeah, we authorized, you folks authorized design about a year and a half, about 2 years ago, I guess it was, for a booster station located just west of Vogelsville, near the interchange.
I remember that, yeah.
To serve that whole development. So we have that, that's on a shelf, that's permit ready. So we could package that design and submit it to DEP and get a permit. We still have to finish up like electrical design, but
Yeah.
but it's almost there because I think it's a matter of when, not if.
So you could help, and the lead time on that would be, to do that project would be.
Couple of years,
Couple of
probably, you know, to get permitted and to
Yeah,
get bids and finish construction, probably 2 years.
But that relies on the water capacity of the Allentown plant, not wells or other rivers or streams or whatever.
Chuck, was that the one where force main was going underneath 78?
Yeah.
Look, we installed that. We installed that and we capped it.
Oh,
We-
okay.
We acquired a casing pipe
Right.
from Upper McConchy Township, so we ran that line and capped it, so to get as ready as we can afford to be. You know, short of having a developer fund the construction of the pump station.
And, you know, giving away the answer a little bit here, but I think it's good context right now. What we're gonna talk through is, again, your need right now is more of an emergency backup. You have a lot of buffer in terms of just the day-to-day need. So in terms of lead time, if you did get one of these large users, this is kind of the same thing we looked at a couple of years ago. You have the supply capacity now. The problem is, what happens if that Allentown main goes down or something like that? So it's, you know, again, you have, and that's one of the things that we have to focus on is weighing those risks.
Yes, to give.
Continue on with the presentation, please.
Basically give some background on what Mike said, you know, we have source capacity and we have our demand projections. So now we can use the supply capacity assessment guidelines from PADEP's Public Water Supply Manual to determine, you know, what are your future supply needs? What type of basis are they? Is it an everyday need? Is it an emergency need? So we can kind of perform that assessment to determine that. So a few definitions before we do that, just, you know, you have your total supply capacity. So that's system capacity with all available sources in service. So looking at, you know, that slide with all the wells on it, you know, those capacities at that bottom, that's 17.7 million gallons per day. You have your reliable supply capacity. So that's your capacity with your largest source out of service. I think for our assessment, we use the Allentown interconnect going down. So that's about 7 million gallons. So now you're at about 10.7 million gallons as your reliable source capacity. And we compare those things based on an emergency condition. So we will look at your reliable supply capacity versus an average day demand, which was the lower of the two lines in that previous slide, that blue line. And we will also look at an MDD, or maximum day demand condition. So that's your total supply capacity versus that red line on the graph. And in order to determine your needs, we'll look at, you know, what's worse, your emergency condition or your maximum day demand, kind of like your everyday condition. So the results basically showed that, you know, as Mike said, you have an emergency supply need. You do not, the supply assessment does not show a need, supply need for everyday use. It shows that you guys are vulnerable if that Allentown interconnection were to go down for any reason. And that is now and projected out to 2045.
So just to point out a couple of numbers on the slide. I mean, so back to kind of what we're saying, if you have a request right now, large user comes in and says, hey, I need 1 million gallons per day. You have enough supply capacity to supply them. You've got an excess of about 3 million gallons per day right now. So you have that buffer there. Even 20 years from now, projecting a slight capacity excess in terms of just the day-to-day use. They said what we're seeing is that, again, if you have an emergency, and again, it is be exasperated by one of these large users. But right now, you have a condition where your supplies are a little bit vulnerable, and to meet that, you need to look at some options to address that. And again, any of these large users would only kind of make that worse.
The Allentown interconnect, it's like 7.2 on the reports we get. Is there additional pumping capacity there that you could get more from that as well?
We'll go into that, but I believe that the pump station capacity is 10.5.
Okay.
So,
But the agreements capped.
yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay, so.
It
Okay.
So, what are the potential risks that can cause this kind of emergency scenario? We wanted to establish these vulnerabilities and then investigate solutions to them. So this was kind of a list we came up with, LCA staff, Mike and I, just look at, what could go wrong, what could put you in that emergency situation. So there was, the worst thing, which would be a combined emergency between CLD and Allentown. But there's also, a loss of power at the water filtration plant. So that would, kind of render the interconnection inactive.
That's the Allentown.
Yes, the Allentown water filtration plant.
Karen, I have a question. Are we getting into too much detail that shows our vulnerability of our system?
Okay.
No, I don't think so. We're not showing any specific areas. It's more general.
Resiliency of power and those are well-known risks for water utilities.
And we could certainly, we don't necessarily have to go into each one in general. I mean, on a general sense.
Just keep it on a high level.
Yeah, like I said, on a general sense, vulnerabilities are main break on one of the major transmission lines. Some sort of loss of supply from the city. The city is a big provider, not just for CLD, but for the valley in general. With that loss of power could be a component of the supply loss from the city. On a high sense, those are kind of the primary. And as we saw, as alluded to, with a large percentage of your existing supply for CLD from Allentown, any sort of vulnerability with Allentown would be the biggest vulnerability for CLD as well.
So we came up, we met with Phil, Amy, everyone to determine, what are our best alternatives in order to mitigate this emergency supply need. So it's high level, you already have some existing emergency interconnections with South Whitehall, one that we established, last year up north. We looked at utilizing the Shant Spring booster that was put in, I believe, when the pump station was being constructed, that interconnection between Allentown and CLD. We looked at utilizing, additional storage, especially in your upper system. We found that there is, with Reservoir One last summer, having to take that out of service, that was a big vulnerability. So that pink area, that Applewood zone, doesn't have any storage of itself to kind of buffer an emergency situation. So we would look at adding storage up there. We looked at increasing the Allentown supply, and then well 17 up north, there is a booster station that can help feed, mitigate any emergencies in that pink, again, Applewood zone again. And then also we looked at, didn't want to call out any specific locations, but optimizing your existing wells and developing new wells to help meet an emergency supply need.
So, again, just to kind of talk about the different types of options here. Primarily boils down to interconnection supply versus either optimize existing wells or developing new wells. Again, as we're kind of progressing with this phase of the study, again, keeping in mind the need is an emergency need as opposed to a today need. The interconnection supply, supplies really lend themselves to that type of need. If we sat here and said, all right, your supply is going to be deficient just on a day-to-day basis, 5 years from now, I think developing new wells would be high on the radar, right? But what we're projecting right now, unless one of these large users come along, is that you would only need whatever these additional supplies are on an infrequent basis whenever you have an emergency type of situation. So an interconnection really kind of lends itself to that because it's sitting there ready. It's a lot easier to develop. Typically, your capital costs are going to be less. So those are kind of different types of options we're looking at right now, and again, the interconnections likely lend themselves to the better option for emergency.
Yep, we're just gonna go into those in a little more.
Were there any areas that needed, like backup power, emergency generators, or anything like that, or that really is not that critical at this point?
The biggest one would be the Allentown filtration plant.
They have 2 feeds
They have
coming
2
in
feet,
now.
yes. We're looking into that in a little more detail again, but yeah, that's the Allentown water plant needs that power at all times.
First one would be those interconnections. Like I said, there are a few existing, that Applewood interconnection to the north. And we've done flow testing with South Whitehall recently in order to determine the capacities of some of these, existing but haven't been used or new interconnection locations. We're proposing to determine how much would we be able to get from South Whitehall? Does it help meet that emergency need if we were to design or activate it?
Which the Applewood is the one that was built last year.
Yeah.
For Reservoir One. Forts is existing.
Forts and Hamilton Boulevard are existing interconnections, but they are manually operated right now. So it just means that there are, in the ground, 2 valves that are closed. If we wanted to open, you'd have to go manually out there, turn the valve and open it. The Applewood interconnection that we designed last year is automated. So it's based on pressure. If the pressure drops to a specific number, the valve will open and trigger that emergency scenario. So Shant Spring and Crackersport Road are 2 areas that we looked at being new and determine how much we could get from there.
So the good thing is South Whitehall does have excess supply.
Exactly.
So they've got supply they're willing, looking to sell. Again, it lends itself, several of these interconnections are already in place or at least very close to each other, that capital improvements to get them active are relatively reasonable.
I also think it's important to point out that South Whitehall does buy water from Allentown, but even they also supplement that purchase with their own wells. And even without that Allentown supply, they still have an excess of water. So if there was like an Allentown emergency and South Whitehall wasn't able to get water from Allentown, they would still have an excess of water that could be transferred to CLD in that case.
How much excess water they have? What I'm just trying to see is.
They have about double, I think. I think they average about 3 and they have over 6.
Yeah, they have about, without
Gallons a day.
Allentown, they have 3.5 million excess. So they can meet their own demands first. And that's what they have. Excess based on their well capacities.
And certainly when we're weighing these different options, that's one of the things that we're looking at again is if South Whitehall was just 100% reliant on Allentown, it's still kind of somewhat ties back to the same one global time. So we want to make sure we're kind of spreading those out so that we do hopefully have independent sources.
Is the South Whitehall supply all treated water?
So yeah, so they've got, similar to CLD, they've got a series of wells coupled with purchasing water from Allentown. So treated wells from their own wells, and then they purchase from downtown as well.
What I'm getting at is if there was increased demand on South Whitehall system, can they treat all that water?
Yes, so these are capacities based on the treatment, their well capacities, so the treatment facilities they have at their wells already. Yep.
Yeah, they're actually underutilized a bit right now due to their interconnection agreements with the city. They purchase a significant amount of supply from the city.
With South Whitehall, their sewer projections are not going to go above their allocated amount, so they're pretty much capped.
And we did, just to go, that water quality testing was performed already when we did the Applewood interconnection. So I would suspect that any future interconnections with them would have similar, similarities between water quality between both systems.
Are you just thinking about emergency connections here in this case, or, I mean, if it was a permanent interconnection, you'd probably have to purchase capacity then, correct?
Correct. So it gets, I mean, the actual physical structure is likely going to be the same regardless of whether it's emergency or permanent. The permitting is going to differ. The interconnection agreement itself is something you would need to work out. And that's where, again, keeping that in mind on the short term versus potential long term. There's a lot of ways to approach it, but you could potentially approach it as, all right, this is emergency interconnection. Now you purchase that emergency reserve capacity, but allow in the agreement to open that up for the future as well. Or again, I mean, in negotiations, if that's an option to some sort of reserve capacity for down the road.
Right.
So the next slide, just what we've already discussed, basically is it would help meet that Allentown, those issues you would have if you were to lose the Allentown source. So the next alternative we looked at was optimizing existing well sources that you have. So I think we discussed earlier when we looked at our source capacity that the wells that are currently active are not maximized to their full permitted amount. So we looked at how much water you could get if you did max out your well output. And that added about, I think, 1.4 million gallons. So you could add 1.4 million gallons, or if you wanted to do upgrades to some of your wells, because there is that excess source, there are excess supply yield from that Arrow study, you could get 2.3. So that's what's on the right. The amount of water you could get. And as Mike mentioned, some of these wells aren't maximized due to treatment issues. Well 12R is one that stuck out to us. So, if you wanted to increase the capacity in order to maximize that well, you might have to spend a little bit of money to add some treatment there, but it is it's an existing source that you already have. So this is more on that permanent basis.
Yeah. So again, this is where, as we are getting to this next stage, we'll talk about weighing the cost of optimizing some of these existing wells versus interconnection, with the knowledge that right now your need is emergency need versus maybe that stuff will all kind of factor in. And again, just to emphasize with the reserve wells, the ones that are essentially out of service right now, putting those back online requires, it's basically starting with a new well.
From scratch.
The extensive permitting
process
needs, field testing needs, things like that.
Yep.
So again, all that cost would be factored in terms of weighing these different options.
Yeah, we looked at it, so wanted to share what you could get from that option, and this would help, mitigate your risks again, lost by Allentown, if that supply were to go down.
Sorry, I think I'm calculating something wrong, help me out. So if the Allentown interconnect goes,
Yes,
something wrong,
okay,
there are
I did not
7,000.
explain this, yes, so,
You're adding 2 and 3, so I'm trying to see how we're gonna close that gap. Am I way off or?
Well, that's where the excess today comes into play.
Yeah.
So right now, again, everything perfect. You guys are good. You have a lot of excess. So that 7 that you're taking right now, you don't necessarily need that whole 7.
because you're not maximizing
all your existing wells.
all your
So
existing.
if you turn all your wells on, operate those as 24 hours a day, you wouldn't need to take 7 MGD from Allentown.
Yeah, basically a
That's
loss
not
of
it.
7 MGD does not mean you have to replace 7 MGD.
Because you can make up for existing sources.
Sorry, I meant to explain that earlier, but I forgot. That is a good catch. So wells, yeah, you'd be able to meet those if you lost the Allentown interconnection. We also looked at developing new wells as part of that. We performed a preliminary hydrogeologic assessment, Janet Fleming did, very high level. The results just showed that there are areas, particularly in your lower system, that could sustain higher yielding wells if we want to move forward and investigate, you know, actually developing these wells. There would be testing and test drilling and all of those types of things, but high level assessment shows that there is support for additional groundwater withdrawal in your lower system if, you know, that permanent need were there. But like Mike has kind of been reiterating, it's more of an emergency need, so this isn't as high on our list.
And Amy, if you could chime in, just the difficulty of drilling new wells is high, isn't it?
Yeah, DEP's permitting process, it's not like it was when we were obtaining wells in the 70s and 80s. It's a whole different ballgame, and there's no guarantees all along the way with each consecutive test. There are things that could, you know, eliminate it for various reasons.
Risks addressed again at Allentown supply. The next alternative we looked at is the Chance Spring booster station. So this, I believe, was put in prior to Chance Spring pumping station being constructed. It was it a
I think it
backup?
was just to bridge the gap till the pipeline was put into service.
Okay.
Chuck you actually helped design that.
Yeah, it was together. There was a drought back then, I believe, and there was a scramble to get more water and the long lead time equipment for the permanent booster station was why we put that in. It was like a skid mounted, sort of like a package system that went in.
And so it pumps directly from Chance
Yeah,
Spring
the city
itself
Chance Spring is
into.
right there, at the border between two systems, so it takes supply directly from the spring into your system.
As opposed to the spring going to
Yeah.
the filtration plant and then back.
And that, the Sean Spring supply goes to Allentown, is treated, then is sent back out again.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna just tap it and use it as source, would have that have to be treated?
There is, yeah.
Yeah, and that was, basically it's a high quality supply, so really all you need is supply with chlorine.
Okay.
And those facilities are there right now.
So when we realized we had this, you know, there's an excerpt from the water supply agreement that says that, you know, we do have the ability to use this as an emergency source up to 2 million gallons a day. Mike and I believe a few other people from LCA, Amy, went in February, I think, to look at the station, and it's in good conditions. Apparently operations goes and inspects once a month to make sure everything is good. It's already tied into SCADA, and like Mike mentioned, there is chlorine feed there already. So I think there might be like a few minor things that need to be done, but it is pretty.
Yeah, operationally, it's pretty well set. It'd be an easy solution. Again, it might be some permitting components of it, because at that point, it's a direct source as opposed to taking from Allentown. But it's a potential, again, a fairly simple solution for the 2 MGD backup.
Yeah, I believe for the permitting, we have some of the water quality information that would be needed for that already based on the filtration plant.
So this might be a good point, since I know we have some guests on the call as well, to indicate that these options that are alternatives, again, if Fleming looked at, are kind of exclusive of any conversations with those third parties. So South Whitehall, of course, we've had some conversation with City of Allentown for this one, would all have to be part of the next phase of things. We were going to kind of make these more of a priority to pursue.
Yeah.
So it's really just kind of what is out there.
Right, yeah, that, we've kind of done preliminary due diligence on all of them to identify if they're feasible, with certain. Any sort of agreements would
Need to be
be
put in place.
something components, but we're forward.
Yeah, and the next I just wanted to show a sketch to show how, you know, you can pump around your main pumping station using this secondary booster. So this alternative would be good if that transmission main, there were to be a break there, if there were issues with the filtration plant upstream, or even if there were issues with your main pumping station, you'd be able to utilize this option to supplement your well supply. We also looked at a few, additional alternatives, smaller scale, like we mentioned earlier, increasing the Allentown supply to that maximum pump station capacity, looking at additional storage in the upper system, just because that was something that really drew our attention last year with Reservoir One going out of service, to help bolster that. And then, like we've already talked about, two generators at the filtration plant, booster pumps to provide secondary feeds to the upper system, pressure zones in the upper system, stuff along those lines. I think that's it for COD.
Good enough to water. Mark Whitehall can obviously be lucky with it.
Yeah.
But do we want to pause for
Yeah.
questions on what we've gone through here?
So generally speaking, just a one sentence description would be, we're not in bad shape.
Correct. And that's, that's the take home. So again, as we progress with this, we went in, particularly with some of these large user requests, we went in, I wouldn't say assuming, but expecting to see a much larger day-to-day need. The fact that you're good day-to-day, it's more emergency need, yeah, you're in good shape.
North Whitehall Division, it's a much smaller system. Your North Whitehall Division is in red on the screen. The blue system is the NBMA system, so Northampton Borough Municipal Authority. They are the current sole source for this North Whitehall system right now through their interconnection. This is a much smaller system. I believe it's about 1 MGD, so 1 million gallon per day production. There's not much else to say. So we didn't have any information like we had with Central Lehigh. There was no Act 537 data to use for projections.
Not yet.
Not yet.
They're undergoing
Sorry.
537
Not
right
yet.
now, so this will be updated when we get their numbers.
And we couldn't get much information out of the township themselves. So we just kind of used a linear regression to project demands based on existing, historical production numbers. So I was wrong, actually. Existing average day demand is about 0.6 MGD, not 1. I believe the agreement with NBMA is that they can supply up to 1 MGD a day. But as we've said, that I know NBMA has an excess of water, and in conversations with them, I believe they would be willing to adjust that agreement and provide more water to North Whitehall as demands increase over the years. They do. So for here, there isn't as much vulnerabilities, or really just that single interconnection with Northampton. So what we looked at to mitigate that is adding a secondary interconnection. So if there ever was to be a main break on the existing one, you would have that second secondary supply. So we looked at 3 locations. Sorry, they're not showing up very well. They looked better on my screen personally on my laptop, but they are yellow. There's one up top that is about 1.5 miles long, and you would be connecting to, so NBMA has multiple pressure zones, as we discussed with LCA having 3, NBMA has 4 or 5. And so this top interconnection would be to the same pressure zone that your existing interconnection is. There's a tank nearby that kind of sets that that hydraulic grade for your system. The lower 2 are about 2 miles each and are to a different pressure zone, but I think that kind of adds more redundancy to your interconnection, because you know, if something were to happen with their Clearview pressure zone, you would still have a secondary supply from their New Egypt pressure zone. So I personally like those 2 for that reason. I believe NBMA is also there's a main extension that they're constructing in that New Egypt, that southern area. So they're extending their system a little bit more to the west. So that would help make that interconnection length a little bit shorter for you know, LCA. We also, the only storage that your North Whitehall system has is the Schnecksville tank, and that is what we call pump storage. So the tank, water has to be pumped out of the tank to provide it to customers. That creates a vulnerability in that if something were to ever happen with those pumps, you wouldn't have that tank of emergency supply. So we also looked at a few, you can see the blue circles, high elevation areas that you'd be able to build a elevated tank to just provide more resiliency to your system by adding, you know, optimization or equalization storage and emergency storage to your system, so you're not dependent on that pump station at Schnecksville.
So yeah, the storage can provide more of a temporary backup. So if you have a main break or something like that, typically you say a main break, hopefully you get repaired in 8 to 12 hours, worst case. So if you have sufficient storage, you can basically hopefully buy some time to get that main back in. It's kind of, again, for this area, that's what we do.
But I think the bigger issue is that single interconnection, if anything were to, I believe it's about 1 mile of a single main from NBMA to the North Whitehall system. So it's a pretty long way to have a vulnerability anywhere along that line would present a supply issue for North Whitehall. So yeah,
Is there an option to connect to South Whitehall, or is it too far away?
we did look at that, but it is along, if you go back, Lisa, you can see it's along, I believe it's 309 would be the connection. I think it was about 5 miles.
Oh,
So it was pretty long.
Yeah.
And it's a pumped, I think that's a smaller pressure zone that we would have to connect to in South Whitehall too. So I don't know what their capacity to be able to supply through there would be, but yeah, it's a good question.
I think there's water to the middle school there on 309, and then that's.
Yeah, we looked, from there.
Right.
Next steps. So we have, you know, all of our alternatives that we looked at. Our next steps for Central Lehigh Division and North Whitehall Division would be kind of narrowing those alternatives down to what we think are the most feasible, and that'll be based on, like Lisa and Mike have mentioned, you know, other parties, how willing they are to work with you, the cost of some of the capital improvements that might be needed, those types of things, and we'll hopefully come out with 2 or 3 top options. And I think, that'll be included in the report.
Yeah,
And we'll want to prioritize.
certainly costs become a big part of this next step. So we'll put estimate capital costs on all these, even they'll look at operating costs, annual costs. Once we have those, again, we know the various risks and what these alternatives mitigate with the risks. Then we'll kind of sit down by workshop type setting, vet these out, and then say, all right, these are the ones that we really want to kind of prioritize. At that point, enter into more thorough discussion, whoever it might be, South Whitehall or whoever, in terms of again, the logistics of making it happen. And then at that point, again, we can prioritize, some plan over the next 5, 10, 20 years that says, all right, these are what you should be looking at, both short-term and long-term, to be what the resiliency of your supplies.
Just one last question, back to the PFAS for a second. Do you know, will those limits be applied at the raw water source or at the tap?
They are the entry point of the system. So essentially, when the well, the supply exit the treatment facility, that's considered the entry point. So that's kind of where.
Okay. So that makes a difference with those wells there, just a matter of combining.
Yeah, correct. Now, if you have 3 wells that feed the same treatment facility, it's, well, that's still be worked out. We believe it's likely to be just the single entry point.
Okay.
But yeah, you don't get credit for combining now in the system.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question, not to go back all the way, but at the beginning, we were talking about the theoretical capacities. Can you just speak to a little bit further what went into extrapolating that data in terms of ascertaining the theoretical capability there?
So those were, we didn't really spend a lot of time in our study to come up with those numbers. Those were from prior studies. Again, most of them, again, they're wells. When you develop a well, you do test drilling and you do monitoring. And oftentimes, you may theoretically get a capacity that's larger than you end up getting permitted for. And that's for a couple different reasons. One, it could just be based on need at the time, that the capacity need wasn't as great. So the permit went in for a lower number in the theoretical. It could be based on, again, some sort of quality component that, after a certain flow rate, you start to see some higher turbidity and things like that. There could be things like that, but basically it's past studies that establish those theoretical capacities.
Okay, so that those could realistically be, could they be vastly different from what is detailed there, or?
Yeah, they could. And we didn't, as far as what we're doing right now, particularly with the need being emergency as opposed to permanent, we didn't put a lot of weight into achieving those theoretical capacities.
Okay. Yeah, and the only reason it raised not a red flag per se, but the only reason it stuck out in my mind was you had mentioned, I think you said 2006. So, just kind of spurred that question for me, but that answers it. So thank you.
Yeah, certainly I wouldn't rely on that. It would be an option, and a lot of investigation we needed to confirm it.
Okay, any other questions from the board? Any questions? Thank you very much for your presentation. Update.
Thank you.
Thank you. All good. Okay, moving on the agenda, we do not have anything as a wastewater. We do have our next item number 7, monthly financial review. That's the second board meeting of the month. Digital board package, pages 6 through 17, and it was included in our documents.
All right, and I will share the screen for Ed's presentation.
So let's take a look at how we did in April. I think you will find that we did pretty well as we go through this. When I first looked at the numbers, I said, sometimes this looks too good to be true, but it is. So for the month, across all three statements. It was really nice to hit on the positive side of the ledger. So LCA and total did as well. We didn't forecast any losses, but at the end of the month, suburban water, wastewater, and city are all favorable with respect to forecast on net income. So LCA comes in on the higher side as well. On cash flows, a little bit different story. Water finished negative, wastewater finished negative, and city division finished positive. But this would be the first month, I think, in the entire year where we had the majority of negative numbers in for the month. We did forecast losses. So at the end of the day, even with the negative numbers against, well, the negative numbers we forecast, we're still almost $1 million better than forecast in total, with some nice variances, favorable variances across all three funds as well. So for the month, I see some negative numbers, but at the end of the day, beating forecast is what we're trying to do. So where we are year to date, well, this is all green, so I'll pause it. That's all right.
I'm trying to get this.
I'm sticking my eyes on it.
It's all green, we can move on.
It's all green and it gets greener, so. So in total, we're good on the positive side, and again, it's nice to say year-to-date variances are positive as well. With suburban water, wastewater, and city division kicking in on favorable variances, and with the favorable income, you usually have favorable cash flow unless you're doing a lot of capital expenditures, and all on the green side again. In total, we're up $14.3 million on year-to-date cash flows. That is all, that again is better than forecast year-to-date across all three funds as well, and again almost $1 million higher. So far so good year-to-date. Full year, we did go back and tweak the forecast a little bit, a lot on the operating side, on capital side some. We're not done yet on the capital side, but it was good to see when we did the first quarter, we kind of held to the budget, and now we're rolling in what we've experienced in the first 4 months, and then, you know, forecasting the rest of the year. And on an income basis, we look pretty good in total on the positive side. And actually, compared to budget, we're up in water, up in wastewater, and also up in city. So LCA in totals up almost $2.1 million. So that's a good thing. We forecasted on a conservative basis with respect to revenues and expenses, and we seem to be inching a little bit at a time better than budget, which is good. Cash flows, we're at a total of $7.9 million in total. All three funds are on the positive side. All three funds are favorable to forecast, and I'm pointing back to suburban water that since we did take in a draw of $3 million higher, that should be pretty much a permanent variance the rest of the year. Just looking at suburban water income, we were up by 68,000. This one kind of had some offsets. Operating revenues went up, operating expenses went down, eroded some of that. Not a big concern in operating expenses. Some discretionary spending was a little bit unfavorable. We're starting to see some pressure inflation-wise on purification chemicals, and so that's going to play out as we see the rest of the year. But most of the variance in that unfavorable spending variance was really driven by higher depreciation. So from a controllable standpoint, not all that bad. And then we obviously got some favorableness on the interest expense, and also lower or interest income. Sorry, favorableness on interest income and interest expense. I'll get it right. So that helped us out. I mean, here's particularly a case for income. year to date that, non-operating items helped us. And I guess that's the good news when you're looking at the favorableness and interest is that's a buffer at the end, so. Maybe a buffer for some of the inflationary effects that we're seeing. Cash flows were up by 446, I'm sorry, full year we're up by $446,000. That's pretty much being driven on the revenue side. I think the big segments in revenue, industrial, commercial, and industrial are all showing a little bit favorable variance in terms of volumes. And so that's what's driving the full year variance on suburban water. Cash flows, year to date, we're up by 40. You can actually look at this and say pretty easy. It's the interest income that's driving a lot of that. Operating wise, we're down a little bit. We talked about the depreciation expense. Debt service and financing was favorable, and we're right at CAPEX forecast level. So this is being helped by interest income. On a full year basis, as I mentioned before, that's pretty much driven by the $3 million of additional money we took to cover what we didn't take down last year. Just looking at some of the metrics, debt service coverage is good. Operating ratio is better than targets. And now the days cash on hand is almost 340 days.
And would you go over again, because I ask this every time because I forget the answer, the operating ratio again, please?
So the operating ratio is nothing more than taking your a formula of operating revenues divided by operating expenses. What it really is just a step along the way to debt service coverage ratio. Your theory is that if you're going to meet debt service, you better be better than 1. And in our particular case, we compared to where we thought what we thought we budgeted. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the wastewater side, income, year to date, we're showing a variance that's 118,000 favorable. Operating revenues are up some. Operating expenses were down. In this particular case, operating revenues were a combination of higher user charges from municipal and also some a little bit higher tapping fees. Operating expenses were basically discretionary spending was lower for the month. And then, of course, the non-operating item for interest income, that's almost $60,000. So that really during the month. So income full year, we're saying we're going to be up by 804. Again, we're predicting that higher volumes. We're holding the line on expenses, and we're taking what we are getting in terms of interest income to help us as well. So far, so good. On the wastewater side, cash flows. $139,000 favorable. That is mostly coming from the operations side and the interest income side. So it's kind of split in between the two of them. CapEx was sort of right in line at 4. And on full year cash flows, we're up by 833,000. We are experiencing and continue to see experiencing higher revenues. And we'll have a negative working capital effect that we built into the forecast to stay conservative. So this could get better if we're a little bit too conservative on the working capital side. I also have some money that we didn't plow back into investment that we could use to buffer that as well. So I want to see that stay on the positive side.
Ed, again, interrupting, but define working capital.
That would be revenues that you didn't or are collecting from last year and expenses that you didn't pay yet. So you didn't cut the cash yet. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens is we're saying that revenues are we're not going to receive as much in revenues. So why I'm saying it's going to be a little bit negative. I could be wrong. That's a tough number to come up with. But the good news is we've got this like $2.5 million worth of invested balances that I'll use to sort of negate the impact of it. On the metrics, down a little bit in terms of debt service coverage ratio, but certainly well above the 1.20. You got the same experience in operating ratio. This is a case where operating revenues were a little bit less than expenses. Now that expense includes depreciation and amortization as well, so. But cash on hand, 253, again, that's better than our target. City division income, so we finished $365,000 up. You can see most of that is coming from operations again. Higher residential, higher commercial, higher industrial revenues. Operating expenses were $90,000 favorable. Non-operating was, we've actually got the forecast for interest income right on this one. And interest expense was lower by 124. So nothing, I mean, that's just a step upward in favorable variances. For the year, we think will be almost $900,000 favorable. That'll mostly reflect the higher revenue projections, higher interest income projections. Cash flows year to date, we're higher by $766,000. Most of that is coming from the operations that we talked about. We did have a timing difference in CapEx this month, and that's why I said we're not done taking a look at CapEx. It actually says that we didn't spend as much as we thought we were going to, and when I was looking at the numbers, said I'm not sure we got that number right timing wise. We'll sort through that. And then we, of course, the interest income of 24,000. So favorable variance. And again, for the year, we think we're going to be slightly better than budget, but not that far away from budget right now. Metrics, all good. Debt service coverage ratio is better than what we budgeted and also better than target. Same thing with operating ratio and days cash on hand at 282 days, so that's good. If you look at the scorecard, lots of green again. Actually, two of them at 13 out of 14, one of them at 14. Pretty hard to get too upset about that. So just some things. Right now, we're experiencing higher residential, industrial, and commercial revenue volumes. That's good. Generally speaking, operating expenses seem to be in line with or better than forecast so far this year. We're not seeing any surprises on that end. We have seen some unfavorable inflation pressure on chemicals and supplies we will be watching. But the higher interest income on all three funds is certainly a good news for us. And like I said, the $3 million of additional spur water borrow will be pretty much for the year. So unless we overspend CapEx by $3 million or something, but we look good. Questions?
I have a question. It's okay with everybody else. Can we get the scorecard in here? When you got that?
Sure can.
That'd be great.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah. No, I do it. I mean,
Little numbers?
What's that?
Don't you read all those little numbers?
No, I look at the scorecard.
yeah. Actually, before I do this, I start with the scorecard
Okay.
to see where I think there's any surprises. So
That'd be great.
I've got questions. On your CDs, your certificates of deposit. You have First Technology Federal CU Credit Union, right?
Right.
Mountain View, California, et cetera, et cetera. How do you find these?
we use an investing agent that staying within the realms and bounds of the Pennsylvania Municipal Authorities Act in terms of risk profile, tries to go out and get us interest rates that are better than the prevailing rate on just CDs.
And again, the organization is what? How do you find these?
They search. We use an investing firm,
An investing firm.
yes, that goes out and searches for municipal bidding investments that are not too risky and that fit within the realm of PMAA law, but that offer better than CD rates. Interesting.
And that firm, we.
Contract, yeah,
We have a contract with them.
we have a contract with them. They actually send me a request to review the investments, and then I look at them and say, yeah.
How do they get paid?
They just take a fee, a small fee on the investment balance.
Okay, so if there's a gross amount here with $245,000, they get a nip of that,
They
or
would get less than 1% of that,
less than 1%.
yes. Yeah. Yeah, they do a pretty good job in terms of finding stuff that I wouldn't be able to find. Just looking on the CDs, going through banks. So, and we've been using them for years.
So I'm nitpicking, but that's okay.
That's
That's
all
my job.
Yeah.
So the net rate here is 5.2%, and they get a percent.
They get less than 1%.
So our take is 4%.
That's 4.45.
And if we went and shopped elsewhere, like to a local bank CD.
Yeah, you would get a lower rate. And you would still pay a fee for them to do some managing, or if we decided to do the buying ourselves, then we would just get the rate, and the rate would tend to be lower, so.
Thank you.
Fair question.
Okay, any other questions for Ed? Board members? Anybody else? I see Mark has a question. You have to unmute it, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two quick questions. Number one, as far as debt service, I don't know how much debt we really have and when it's set to expire. Is there any date in the near future where we anticipate a major increase due to the reduction of debt service?
You would
Or overall
probably,
budgeting?
no, I'm gonna say the fund with the most debt is on the city side. And if you look at the way that was structured to accommodate the amended concession agreement and amended indenture, we tried to lay out a larger portion of principal payments in the last, I'll call it last 15 years of that term. So given that it's at $350 million to start with, that would be the fund that you would say have more risk on the tail end of debt service. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, I was just looking for an approximate date if there's anything near term that's coming off, but it looks like we're 15 to 20 years. Looks like we're not front end loaded on that, so we're 15 years out is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Yes, and quite frankly, between myself and even Concord Financial, we look to refinance any time that we can see some debt service savings, so.
Okay. Well, that's going to be interesting now, the way the interest rates are going, so I don't
Well,
anticipate any of that happening soon, right?
To be honest with you, there are still some situations that might be favorable to us, depending on the profile of the debt themselves. Because if we have, I'll call it taxable debt, like we issued when we redid the city, it's still always beneficial to look and see if you can turn that into tax exempt debt. And the laws may come into play as well. We had the inability to do advanced refunding, and now that is starting to play out a little bit differently and pressure from financial people in the state. So we'll see. I mean, so we always look to refinance when it makes sense to do that, and that's what we'll do.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, this is a follow on. Where is in the budget in any places the like, for example, the funds that we got from having to do with Representative Day and the Heidelberg issue, the grant funding we got from the state. I don't know how much that was. Was it 150,000 or 75,000? There is some money that came in from the state in the form of grants. And I don't know if there's any rescue funds that we're seeing from any other areas. Is that reflected in the current operating budget at all, or in this
No.
financial statement? It is not.
It definitely would not be in the operating budget. What I can say is that starts to firm up more, we will incorporate it into our forecast. And because we don't go through the entire year just relying on the budget, we forecast what we're doing. So what I'm trying to answer that at some point in time, when I'm firm on what that is in the projects and we know what we're gonna spend, if we are, you know, on any of that this year, then we'll try to work that into the forecast.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mark. Any other questions from board members? Financial information. Okay, moving on then. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. A lot of green.
It's good.
All right, moving on, monthly system operations overview. Digital board package pages 18 to 19. And the April report was included in our documents.
And Chris, you want to take that one?
I'll take that. Not today, so I'll try to do them justice. Under critical activities for water production and wastewater treatment, our April 2023 averages are well in line with historical numbers, so there's no real outliers there. Jumping down to the next section, notice of violations for the month of April, we had 0 for both sides. We did have 1 sanitary sewer overflow, or a bypass, I should say, and I'll talk about that in a second. In the suburban side, we had 1 minor main break repaired. We had 1 injury accident that I'll touch on a little bit in a second as well. And we had 0 emergency declarations. Under significant repairs and upgrades, we have brought the South Mountain Reservoir offline, and we're doing some cleaning and some internal small repairs, some concrete work. Should be done in about 5 or 6 more weeks. It's another one of those situations like Reservoir 1 coming offline where we're being super cautious and making sure that we don't have any bad effects throughout the system. So we're keeping an eye on it. The bypass occurred at the Kleins Island wastewater treatment plant on April 30th. We had a pump that failed to start during an extreme wet weather event, and we had to bypass around 1,600 gallons. We were able to maintain a peak flow of roughly 89 million gallons during that event. We had 1 arm injury, muscle strain, when one of our employees tried to lift something. I don't want to call it non-serious, but the employee's fine. No real mistime work from that. And the only other thing of note that we wanted to bring up was our Sand Spring permit exceedance. We had 4 of those in the month of April. There's a typo at the top of the header there. I believe that should say April 2023, not March. The ongoing issues out at Sand Spring, Andrew and team, along with a lot of internal staff and some external resources and engineering firms, are still working to get that squared away.
Have we an agreement on that yet, or is that when is that anticipated?
So the corrective action plan or the compliance plan was submitted by DEP's deadline of April 15th, and still awaiting any feedback from DEP on next steps.
All right, did we forecast any elimination of that problem by some date in
Well,
our solution?
I think yes, I mean, the solutions in the compliance plan are laid out for DEP, but we need their feedback to understand kind of the next steps that they approve of and the timeline that they approve of. And it's also tied into some work we've been talking about partnering with Whitehall on their Act 537 plan, which may present some additional alternatives. So it's going to take a while to get through.
Okay. One other question I had on South Mountain Reservoir, that's a very large facility. Certainly having it offline for that long amount of time, is it actually drained, or is it
completely drained. There's some pictures and maybe we should have Andrew put a couple on a slide or something. It's really impressive on the inside.
Yeah.
And,
I see that.
you know, it was well organized, well scheduled, and actually as part of the field services division, we stopped a bunch of the maintenance that we were doing in the area to make sure that we didn't accidentally break a valve, or, you know, we were doing work on the steel line. We stopped that just to make sure that we wouldn't have any impedance of water flow through that portion of our serving area. So.
Yeah. Right.
One other comment, so since Andrew's not here, we can beat him up, but maybe we don't wanna call the arm injury a highlight. Maybe other information, I don't know, to you guys.
Very good.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you. All right, staff comments,
Nothing additional to that.
solicitor comments,
No comments, thank you.
public comments on any topics at all?
No, thanks, Brian.
No comment here.
Getting right. All right, board comments. All right, this meeting is adjourned. We're going to have an executive session following this. Let's make it at 10 minutes before 2, and it's for personnel issues. All right, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and have a good day.